Thank you for joining us for this talk, one of Ladysmith and District Historical Society's Historically Speaking series. This is the title for our talk today, Thomas Russell's 1870 to 1871 diary while superintending a coal mine in the Queen Charlotte Islands, now called Haida Gwaii, a window into early colonial British Columbia. In September of 2024, Michael Gould, a Ladysmith, Vancouver Island resident, called the Ladysmith archives saying he had 2 plastic bags full of family papers that he wanted to find a home for. His words to me were, "I've got something that'll knock your socks off." Intrigued, I agreed to meet with him and collected the bags. Now, Michael thought that the family scrapbooks with newspaper articles and the mound of family photos from the 30s to the 60s would be the most interesting and do the trick, but he was wrong. At the bottom of one bag was a bundle of 4 handwritten notebooks held together with twine. They were filled with beautiful copperplate script, 3 of the notebooks in ink, the 4th in pencil. On inspection, these notebooks constitute a daily diary written by Thomas Russell, great-great-grandfather of Michael Gould, chronicling his 7.5-month sojourn superintending a coal mine in Skidegate Inlet, Queen Charlotte Islands, now called Haida Gwaii, in 1870-1871. I thought the diary so special that I spent the next 16 months transcribing the notebooks and researching the background to Thomas Russell's story, putting all in a website. And I'm using this talk to unashamedly promote this website. It's simple to find. All you do is Google Ladysmith Historical Society, Thomas Russell Diary. And when you open the website, this is what you're going to see. It opens with some background and a general introduction. And if you look on the left-hand side of the opening page, you'll see a list of website contents. The About This Book, which faces you when you open the website, and then the diary, volumes 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is where the transcription of those 4 notebooks that I mentioned lie. Also, there's background to Thomas Russell, to discovery of coal in the Skidegate Inlet area, to the Queen Charlotte Coal Company, the company which Thomas Russell ended up working for, and some geological stuff, and background on people and incidents that happened, and medicines that were employed, interesting things like that. Now, you can either navigate the website and work your way down through this list here, or you can read through the text of the diaries, and there are links to the background information within the diary text. So now you know about the website and you know how to get to it. This talk is basically organized as a teaser to prompt you to go to the website. I've organized the talk into 3 main pieces: the background of the diary, which covers who Thomas Russell was and how he came to superintend the coal mine in the Queen Charlotte Islands, a bit about the discovery of coal in the Queen Charlotte Islands, and a bit about the Queen Charlotte Coal Mining Company. And armed with that, we reach a point where Thomas Russell is ready to embark on his adventure. And that's where we start the diary teaser. And basically, I just give a little teaser excerpts from certain parts of the diary to give you a flavor of what's in it. The aftermath is what happened to Thomas upon his return to Victoria at the end of his stint in the Queen Charlotte Islands. So who was Thomas Russell? He was born in 1836 in Haddington in Scotland. His brother-in-law, Kenneth Mackenzie, was contracted by Puget Sound Agricultural Company, which was a subsidiary of the Hudson's Bay Company, to establish a farm in Victoria. And Thomas left England for Vancouver Island in 1852 at the age of 16, listed as a laborer amongst Mackenzie's employees. And as such, he was bound by a 5-year contract with the Puget Sound Agricultural Company. Although classed as a laborer, Thomas was well educated, and you can see that through reading his diaries. Okay, this is just a picture of Thomas Russell's brother-in-law, Kenneth Mackenzie, the man responsible for dragging Thomas out from Scotland to Vancouver Island. Mackenzie and his group of some 70 Scottish settlers set sail on August the 14th, 1852 from Gravesend, England, aboard a ship called the Norman Morrison, and that was a Hudson's Bay Company supply ship that made annual journeys between England and Victoria, traveling around the Horn between 1849 and 1853. Thomas Russell and his sister Isabella, who was classed as a domestic servant, were traveling in steerage, while his sister Agnes and her husband Kenneth Mackenzie and their children were occupying cabins. After traveling around the Horn, they arrived in Royal Roads, Fort Victoria, on Sunday, January the 16th, 1853. Although this view here is Victoria in 1860, it gives an idea of what would have met them when they arrived. You can see in the center here the stockade of the Hudson's Bay fort with the buildings inside. By the way, this map shows, this little eye shows the view that you can see above. You're looking basically southeast across Victoria Harbor in this view here. So we have the Hudson's Bay fort. We have in 1860, the town was spilling out beyond the fort to the north, a little bit to the south. And we also have the first government buildings down here and a significant Songhees First Nation presence over here with extensive longhouses. The location of the farm Mackenzie was to establish was just north of Victoria, this being the gorge in here. And it was one of 4 farms to be established by the Hudson's Bay Company to feed the growing colony and service the Navy. Craigflower Farm, which is where Mackenzie and Thomas Russell ended up, this is a photograph of the farm in 1880, so about 10, 15 years after Thomas was working at it. And what it shows is there's a schoolhouse here separated by the gorge, which is connected by a bridge to the rest of the farm. This is the manor house, Craigflower Manor House here, and a series of farm buildings. The farm itself was about 900 acres in size. And it was established in 1853, that's the year Mackenzie arrived, on land which had been purchased by treaty from the Esquimalt or Cossapsum First Nation in 1850. The area where the farm was to be established had been called Maple Point by the Hudson's Bay Company because of maple trees that grew there. And Kenneth Mackenzie, in what could be considered a bit of brown-nosing, named the farm Craigflower after the Hudson's Bay Company Governor Andrew Colville's estate in England. As I mentioned, it was one of 4 farms to provide food to the Hudson's Bay, Fort Victoria, and settlers in an effort to transition the Vancouver Island colony from a fur trading outpost to a settler colony. This is the manor house stands today. This is a picture taken on the website of the National Historic Site. It's a National Historic Site. This house was built between 1853 and 1856 to house the immediate Mackenzie family, in other words, Agnes and Kenneth Mackenzie and their daughters. Thomas wasn't lucky enough to live in this house. He wasn't an immediate family, so he lived in an outbuilding belonging to the farm. Let's follow Thomas Russell's early career and see how he ended up superintending a coal mine in the Queen Charlotte Islands. He arrived in 1853 in Victoria, and between then and 1861, he worked at Craigflower, assisting his brother-in-law, Kenneth Mackenzie, with managing of the bakery, butchery, and flour mill. In 1859, he married Sarah Collier, who had arrived in Victoria 2 years earlier, in 1857, aboard the Hudson's Bay Company ship Princess Royal. 1861, his brother-in-law's contract as bailiff of Craigflower was not renewed, and that prompted Thomas to leave Hudson's Bay or Puget Sound Agricultural Company's employment and accompany his brother-in-law, who was continuing farming and had contracts supplying baked goods to British naval vessels anchored at Esquimalt. And that occupied Thomas from 1862 to 1865. This is a picture about 1866 of the Russell family. And you can see there are three children. This is Thomas Russell, his wife, Sarah, and their eldest daughter here, Alice, who was born in 1860, their second child, Catherine, and their third child, son, Robert Henry, born in 1865. A rather charming family group. In 1865, Thomas became teacher at the Craigflower School. And by all accounts, he appears to have been a significant improvement over his predecessor. The parents in July 1865, after the yearly examination, remarked that their children have learned more in 2 months than in a year before with Mr. Claypole, who was Thomas's predecessor. This is a picture of Craigflower School about 1864. And in it, we can see Thomas Russell, his eldest daughter, and I think that's his wife. This is Mr. Claypole, who Thomas Russell ended up succeeding as teacher in the school. This school, which still stands today, was built between 1854 and 1855, and is the oldest surviving school building in Western Canada, and is a National Historic Site in itself. That's, as I said, Thomas Russell and his family at the time. This is Craigflower School today, and this is Michael Gould, the great-great-grandson of Thomas Russell, and this is his cousin, Kerry Parker. In 1866, while Thomas was still teaching at the school, amongst themselves, the Board of Education noted that his annual salary was $1,000 a year, compared to $500 paid to teachers in other rural districts. And they resolved to replace him by transferring the assistant teacher from the Fort Street Boys School in Victoria to Craigflower at an annual salary of $750. This was kept secret. A month later, in 1866, despite favorable examination results, the superintendent reported that Russell was to be discharged for being by far the least efficient and for lacking formal teacher training, this despite significant improvement in the school results. They neglected to lay him off, however. Thomas must have gotten wind of his impending layoff. In 1866, in October of 1866, he abruptly resigned to open a grocery store in Victoria. His abrupt resignation left the school board in a bit of a pickle, even though they had been intending to lay him off. Not sure why they took so long about doing it. They were left sort of hanging and had to scramble to find a teacher for the school. That created bad blood, and they never did pay Thomas his salary for September. This map is of downtown Victoria today. Thomas had 2 successive locations for his grocery store in Victoria. The first one was near the intersection of Yates and Government Street, and the second one was on the intersection of Fort Street and Blanchard. Things seemed to be going okay. He had a successful grocery business. However, what we'll find through the talk today is that Thomas was not the luckiest of men. Tragedy struck in 1869 in September when his 4-year-old son, Robert Henry, died. And this loss deeply, deeply affected him and his tight-knit family. And his diary contains many sorrowful references to his little boy. A second tragedy followed less than a year later. The grocery store burnt down and was a total loss. So he had no means of supporting his family. And it seems, although I didn't see it stated anywhere, that this loss appears to have prompted Thomas to take up the position of superintendent of the Queen Charlotte Coal Mining Company Limited, leave home and family for the Queen Charlotte Islands in September of 1870. Thomas had no previous experience with coal mining whatsoever, so this was a leap into the dark for him. So Thomas is poised to go to Queen Charlotte. Let's look at background on coal in the Pacific Northwest and the Queen Charlotte Coal Mining Company Limited. From the 1830s, the British Admiralty was pivoting towards steam-powered vessels, and coal was becoming increasingly important as a strategic commodity. In 1835, coal deposits were realized by settlers and the Hudson's Bay Company to be present on northeast Vancouver Island. And that resulted in between 1849 and 1851 of construction of Fort Rupert by the Hudson Bay Company, who were intending to both trade with the local First Nations there and also mine coal. In 1851, Robert Dunsmuir and a party of Scottish miners arrived at Fort Rupert and commenced a 3-year contract to mine coal there. The coal mining venture was spectacularly unsuccessful, and considerable rancor developed between the miners and the Hudson's Bay Company, and also there was a very fraught relationship with the local First Nation. Meanwhile, back down toward Victoria, in 1851, Kayatsakun, who is coal Tyee, reported the presence of coal at Wentoosan Inlet to the Hudson's Bay Company in Victoria. The following year, a Hudson's Bay employee, Joseph McKay, verified that report. Mining ceased at Fort Rupert. Dunsmuir and the remainder of his party were reassigned to the Hudson's Bay coal operations at Wentoosan Inlet. And thus began over a century of coal mining in the Nanaimo area and Vancouver Island's coal boom. So what about the Queen Charlotte Islands? Well, things went from a gold rush to a coal rush. The California gold rush started in 1848 and had resulted in significant influx to Western North America of fortune seekers infected with gold fever. And when 2 samples of gold from the Queen Charlotte Islands were brought to Fort Simpson in 1850, the Hudson's Bay Company kept it as quiet as they could and launched a series of expeditions to investigate. And this is where the gold discovery was made on the northwest shoreline of Moresby Island here. This is a portion of a map produced in 1855 by the Royal Geographical Society of London. Later, in 1851, when news of the discovery at what had become known as Gold Harbor in the Queen Charlotte Islands leaked beyond the Hudson's Bay Company, a brief rush ensued. And the British authorities were fearful of a significant influx of American prospectors and loss of control in the area. So they sent 2 ships successively to the area to check on the situation. The first was HMS Thetis, which arrived in Esquimalt in 1852, and the second was HMS Virago, which arrived not very long after HMS Thetis had left in early 1853. This is HMS Thetis, which was in the Pacific Northwest from May 1852 to January 1853 under the captaincy of Augustus Leopold Cooper. Here in Ladysmith, we're very familiar with the name Thetis, as we have Thetis Island, which is named after this ship. I hasten to say that HMS Thetis never sailed around Thetis Island. It was not in this part of the archipelago. Upon arriving in Esquimalt, HMS Thetis did its necessary duties and reported to Governor Douglas, etc., and then proceeded up to the Queen Charlotte's to check out the gold rush to see what was happening and whether it was being overrun by American prospectors. They arrived in Gold Harbor on the 16th of June, 1852, sailed in through this channel. The actual gold discovery was here. The ship came in and ended up anchoring in here, which is they called Thetis Cove, and there was absolutely nobody around. The gold rush had flared and fizzled pretty quickly. So the ship had no peacekeeping or no sort of legal issues to tend to. And the master, George Moore, after who Moore Hill on Thetis Island is named after, proceeded to survey the surrounding area and produce this map. And they named it after people like Cooper Island, that was named after Captain Cooper of the ship. Douglas Harbor down here, named after James Douglas, governor of the colony. Mitchell Harbor, Mitchell was captain of one of the Hudson's Bay Company boats that plied the coast of British Columbia, and so on. Interestingly enough, the sailing ship HMS Thetis had a heck of a time getting out of here due to adverse winds and had to be towed out by their ship's boats. Second time they came in here a couple of months later to check up on the situation. Captain Cooper kept the ship outside the channel and sent a lieutenant in a little sailing boat and checked it out. Nobody was there, came back, and they just left. The second ship, HMS Virago, arrived a couple of months after HMS Thetis had left. And it was a dual side-wheeler and sailing vessel. And it arrived in Victoria, paid its social courtesies, and then proceeded north with a guy called Captain Stewart, who was a Hudson's Bay Company captain, after whom Stewart Channel is named. And they were tootling up what was mapped as the east coast of Vancouver Island and came to the area of Porlier Pass, at which point Captain Stewart said to Captain Prevost, after whom Mount Prevost is named, Prevost was the captain of the Virago, he said, you know, this is the east coast of a set of islands. It's not the east coast of the main island. You could go in there and have a look. So Prevost decided to go through Porlier Pass, and he did so at slack tide. And they rum-tootled around Trincomalee Channel. I'm not sure if they circumnavigated what later became known as Thetis and Penellicut Islands. They may have, they may not have. But on the way out, it was slack tide no more, and the ship got caught by the significant currents in the pass, and the stern of the ship got swept up on a rock. The tide was falling, the ship was stuck on the rock, and they were debating what to do about it. And while they were debating what to do about it, the paymaster of the ship drew this pen and ink image of the ship up on the rocks in Porlier Pass. They managed to get her off in the end, but they lost quite a few feet of their keel and some other bits of the bottom of the boat. But thank goodness it was still relatively seaworthy, and they were able to proceed north on their voyage. They put in at Fort Simpson, and then were proceeding to the Queen Charlotte's to check out if there was still any latent activity associated with the gold rush. Captain Prevost had intended to sail up the west coast of the Queen Charlotte's and enter Gold Harbor, but the weather was terrible, and instead he opted to proceed to up the more protected eastern shoreline. And while doing so, the Virago entered Skidegate Inlet, an inlet between the two main islands forming the Queen Charlotte Archipelago, on May 14th, 1853, and they anchored near a large Indian village there, and they had significant interaction with the First Nations while they were there. While there, the son of one of the Haida chiefs, who was called Captain Bearskin, took Captain Prevost and his chief engineer, Bain, to view a local coal deposit. And this is the earliest record of coal in the Skidegate Inlet area of the Queen Charlotte Islands. Nothing came of it at the time, which seems to indicate that Chief Engineer Bain can't have been too impressed with what was shown to him, because you would have thought that a chief engineer of a coal-burning vessel would have been excited about a sustainable source of fuel in such a frontier location, but nothing really happened. But what did happen was that in the 1855 map produced by the Royal Geographical Society, the location of the coal here in Skidegate Inlet was mapped. And this is the first mapped indication of coal on the Queen Charlotte Islands. 1855 mapped. The Virago was there in 1853. So everything went quiet until 1859, when interest was renewed in the Queen Charlottes by the exhibition in Victoria of a 14-ounce gold nugget that had been purchased by the Hudson's Bay Company agents from Queen Charlotte Islands hideout. This piqued James Douglas's interest, and he hired a guy who was called Major William Downey to renew prospecting for gold on the islands. Downey was not an army major, but somehow he got the name Major. He was hired by Douglas because Downey had had considerable success in the California gold rush, and since then had been active in prospecting up in British Columbia. This is a picture of William Downey. And having been contracted by James Douglas, Downey and a party of 27 miners or prospectors arrived at Gold Harbor in July of 1859 and started looking for gold. They found none. Casting further afield, Downey reported on prospecting east along Skidegate Inlet, and his report, a part of his report reads, "We found black slate and quartz, something or other. Further north, granite appears, and then sandstone and conglomerate. And as we were now in a coal country, it was no use to look for gold. We saw coal here, but I cannot speak as to its quality, not being a judge of it. The formation is similar to that of Nanaimo." What Downey saw was probably the same coal deposit that had been shown to Captain Prevost of HMS Virago 6 years earlier. Now, at that time, the Nanaimo coal mining operations, 1869, were expanding, and people were interested in getting in on the bandwagon. If you had coal, you had a way to riches. Downey's comment about the formation in Skidegate Inlet to being similar to that of Nanaimo could have been what piqued the interest of a group of Victoria investors who in 1864 sent a party of coal miners from Victoria to assess the Skidegate Inlet deposit. Their first expedition was a bit of a disaster. It took 6 weeks to make the trip up from Victoria to Skidegate. They left on August the 1st, 1864, and arrived in September 15th. They found the coal outcrop on September the 17th, but by that time, they'd eaten pretty well all their supplies and were forced to depart for Victoria on the 18th without having conducted a proper assessment. However, they had proven that there was a seam of anthracite 4 foot 6 inches thick. Now, anthracite was extremely valuable because of its thermal properties. It was more, if you like, heat-giving than the bituminous coal that was found in Nanaimo, and was more useful for smelting and things like that. So a very valuable type of coal. On the basis of that information, the Queen Charlotte Coal Mining Company Limited was registered in Victoria on June the 5th, 1865. And on July the 6th, 1865, a call to shareholders was made for funds to underwrite a second expedition to Skidegate Inlet. Now, that call for underwriting funds post-dated the investors actually sending a party of prospectors up to the Queen Charlottes, which they did on May 31st, 1865. And the reason why they sent the group of people up to the Queen Charlottes before they actually had sufficient funds to underwrite the deal was because they didn't want anyone to pip them at the post and preempt the coal deposit in the Queen Charlottes. They hired a guy called Mr. Robinson, who was a photographer, to lead the expedition. So you could think, why hire a photographer to go assess a coal deposit that you might be significantly investing in? It says here, Robinson was provided with photographic apparatus and will take views of the surrounding country. I've looked, I haven't found any of his photographs of his first visit to the Queen Charlotte Islands, unfortunately. I'd love to know if anyone else knows of any. Robinson had some experience with coal, though. He was previously superintendent of a coal mine in Nanaimo. He was also a guy that was looking to make some money, and he had a history of looking for the big break. And he was also a significant shareholder in the coal company. So he may have been somewhat unbiased, shall we say, in his assessment of what he saw. Anyway, he came back to Victoria in August and submitted a report to the company, and which was very positive, and everyone was very excited by what he had to say. The early opening lines of his report say, "We were rewarded by striking a seam of anthracite coal, which was cropping out on the side of a high range of hills, which afterward proved to be a branch of a mountain, some 2,000 or 3,000 feet in height." So nice seam of anthracite discovered. And this is where they had come in here and they'd hacked their way through the bush, come up here and discovered the outcrop of coal about 300 feet above sea level on the side of a mountain up here. He then had spent some time scouting out the extent of the anthracite deposit in here, and also sort of thought about how to develop the deposit, how to get the coal from the mine down to a shipping location down here. And he came up with the idea of a tramway through the bush down to the wharf from the mine. And this shows, basically, it's just the elevation of that red line going down through here. So there were some fairly steep grades to be handled on the line of this tramway. Robinson traced the outcrop of the seam for 200 or 300 yards, finding it varying in thickness from 3 to 7 feet, but of excellent quality. And the entire distance from the extreme points at which outcrops were found would be from 1 to 2 miles, quite a difference, having in each case the same characteristics and being a similar quality to that first struck. So he thought, there's quite a lot of anthracite here. Now, how much is it going to cost to develop? And he thought, well, the cost of opening the seam to an extent that it would be necessary to make it at least self-supporting will not, I think, exceed $1,500. So that's pretty cheap. And after the work is fully and thoroughly opened, the coal can be produced for about $4 a ton, inclusive of all labor, etc., in the digging of the coal to its delivery upon the wharf. He estimated the cost of building the tramway at about $10,000, exclusive of the cost of a wire rope, which there was part of the tramway would have been double tracked. And the idea was that the heavily laden coal cars coming down the hill would hold the empties back up on that part of the track. The rest of the track, horses would haul empties up because the grade was manageable. Robinson continued to say, "Should my views of the extent of the seam be realized, of which I have not the slightest doubt, I see no reason why any reasonable quantity of coal, say 1 to 4,000 tons per month, may not be obtained from the seam after it is in working order." He also postulated the cost of delivering anthracite to San Francisco, which was the main target market, was estimated not to exceed $10 a ton. So $14 a ton in total cost against realized prices of $16 to $25 a ton. So they thought they'd make quite a bit of money. And their competition was anthracite, either from Pennsylvania or from Europe. And in that time, early 1870s, the transcontinental railways hadn't come through, so everything had to be shipped around the Horn. They were confident of the markets, and they were also confident that the mine could be brought to active and producing coal at the wharf by April 1866. So about 6 months, 7 months from when they had assessed the existence of the deposit. They lost no time in having plans and specifications prepared for the works required to be done at the mine, and contractors were invited to submit tenders. However, the tenders received were considered unacceptable, and the directors decided to manage the work themselves. Robinson was kept on as a superintendent, and an experienced foreman, a man called Brown, plus a number of skilled workmen consisting of carpenters, blacksmiths, axemen, laborers, and surveyor were hired. And on October the 6th, 1865, a 31-man party with 6 months' provisions and supplies set sail from Victoria for Skidegate Inlet on 2 schooners, the Alpha and Goldstream. They had enough rail and material for a mile of tramway and enough lumber to start construction of a large wharf 180 feet wide. I don't know why they'd need one that wide, and 120 feet long. The workmen were contracted for 5 months with an additional month if required. It was anticipated that the mine would be opened and the works completed for the delivery of coal within that time frame. Over the next months, significant enthusiasm reigned, as shown in this newspaper article from December the 12th, 1865, a report from the schooner Goldstream, which had just arrived in Victoria, come down from Skidegate Bay, Queen Charlotte Islands, with very encouraging news for members of the coal mining company. 3 distinct veins of anthracite have been found, all of which are believed to be of great width. The company has erected substantial houses, work on the tramway has been commenced, and both tracks of the tramway will be only 1.1 miles in length, and everyone was well. So everything looked pretty rosy. However, all was not well. Over time, work advanced more slowly than anticipated, and the anthracite deposit proved complex geologically, with appraisal going hand in hand with development, and believe you me, that's never a good thing. J.J. Landale, who was superintendent for a number of times between 1867 and 1869, commented in his reports, "A great deal of very expensive prospecting has been done, but generally in most injudicious places, and all the works for mere exploration are much too good." In other words, they hadn't done enough assessing of the deposit and had built primo development infrastructure without proving up the resource. The old tramway, partially constructed, is a job that should have been left till a sufficient working had been obtained. Neither is it by any means the best route, being longer than the route adopted by Mr. Green, which has the merit of common sense to recommend it. It is much to be regretted that all the money spent on this tramway had not been applied to proper prospecting the field. He also noted wastage and unnecessary purchase of expensive equipment. Tons of wood are lying rotting in different parts of the bush, and many things purchased not by any means requisite for a young coal work, to wit, iron scuttles such as used in Staffordshire for handling iron ore, and, as Mr. King informs me, a lot of smoothing irons. So, problematic. Things bought that shouldn't have been bought, money spent on developing before proper appraisal of the resource. He was also scathing about the workforce. "In all my experience in coal mining, I have never met with a more turbulent, disobliging, grumbling set of men. From the day we left Nanaimo till the day we left the island, it has been one intermitting growl." But nevertheless, he continued in an optimistic vein. He forecast in excess of 100,000 tons of mineable coal in 2 of the 3 seams recognized. And he reported that The company possessed a property containing 6,000 acres in which 3 veins of anthracite are found, and it is now in a condition to make returns. Various proofs costing large sums of money have been made, which proofs have turned out well for the slight depth on the vein at which they are made. There's a sort of hidden caveat about the proofs, the slight depth on the vein at which they're made. They didn't go very deep. He also said a substantial tramway had been built with a large and strong chute and a sufficient wharf in progress of completion. A store and several houses, outhouses, blacksmith and other shops are already on the ground, as well as wagons and mules. This is a map of the company workings at the time Thomas Russell arrived in October of 1870. We can see down here, there's the shipping wharf had been built by the time he arrived. There were coal stores and company buildings down here. And the brown line here is the tramway that connects the workings up here, these coal outcrops in here, which were being mined and from which the coal had to be shipped. So Russell got there and supposedly everything was workable. This is the only photograph I found of the mine. It was photographed in 1902. That's just over 30 years after Thomas Russell left the site. The mine had been abandoned. As you can see, everything's in pretty rough shape. From 1870, the continuing story of the mine is taken up by Thomas Russell's diary. And now, that's the back of the background. Thomas Russell's ready to get on ship to the voyage up, and the mine has been developed to the point where Russell's supposedly able to continue mining coal and ship it out. We'll see that things were problematic. And I'm going to give you a teaser to the diary, basically trying to prompt you to go to the website and read it for yourself. This is the introduction to the diary as written by Thomas. And I'm going to go through it here because it gives an indication of the literacy of Thomas and some of the writing style that he had and employs in his diary. Introduction: there are few readier means of attacking the testimony of a traveler than to point out that he tells improbable stories, things not perhaps physically impossible, but unfamiliar to the critic's experience, and therefore not set down by him in the catalogue of likely incidents. This kind of criticism, however, has the serious fault of going hand in hand with ignorance. The less the critic knows of the world, the more things, of course, seem unlikely to him. And in the long run, his assault is apt to strengthen the very evidence it was directed against. I will not, however, trouble myself longer about such criticisms or critics. This little diary is intended for the eye of one critic only, and that critic is my dear wife. For her amusement alone shall the following pages be written, and the interest she will take in perusing them will more than repay me for my small efforts. As I now write, I feel rather gloomy, fearing that these pages will lack incident to make them interesting. When a man writes a book and takes certain character for the foundation of the tale, he can crowd or lessen the incidents at will. But in a diary where stern truth and not fiction must be embraced, the writer is entirely at the mercy of what the day may bring forth. But should one page lack incident and the other be too crowded, make these a set-off for the other. Thomas Russell, aboard sloop Thornton, 21st of September, 1870. Departure. Thomas Russell departed on the sloop Thornton from Victoria Harbour on the 21st of September, 1870. And just to give an idea, he sets the scene. Left my wife and home at 3:00 a.m., went down to the sloop Thornton, found all on board, fast locked in the arms of Morpheus. Morpheus is the Greek god of dreams. Roused up the captain. Having completed his toilet, which did not occupy more than 5 minutes, he said he would go and call Mr. Warren, who is owner of the vessel. In the meantime, he instructed the chief mate to get some coffee ready by the time he returned. I accompanied the captain to the house of the owner, which, by the way, is not a stately mansion, but what is vulgarly termed a shanty, with one room and a kitchen. We roused him up and then returned to the sloop to find hot coffee awaiting us. At 4 o'clock, the 3 white men came on board. These were 3 men who were contracted by the coal company. The Chinamen, there were 3 Chinamen, having slept on board that might be ready for a start. There appeared to me to be a great deal of time wasted in looking at this and trying that until 5 o'clock, when we pushed off from the wharf with just sufficient wind to keep the sails spread. So Thomas was on his way. This is a photograph of the Thornton. However, it's a photograph of the ship after a significant refit. Thomas traveled up in 1871, and when he did, the Thornton was a single-masted sloop. In 1871, upon returning to Victoria after having dropped Thomas off, the owner, Captain Warren, had the ship extended and refitted to a 2-master schooner to be more useful for a sealing venture, which he was beginning to partake in. But anyway, it's the same boat that Thomas traveled up to the Queen Charlotte's in. It's photographed in Victoria Harbour. This is Captain Douglas Warren, who owned the Thornton, and he is an interesting character. He plied the coastal waters of British Columbia from about 1858 to 1871, freighting cargo, passengers, and trading dogfish oil and furs. Dogfish oil was used as a lubricant in the logging industry for skid roads, and also for the misery whips, the saws they used for cutting down trees. It was also used as a fuel for lamps in coal mines in Nanaimo. Warren didn't confine his activities to legal activities only. In 1867, he was convicted of selling whiskey to the Indians. In 1868, there was a very famous incident where he and his crew in the Thornton were involved in a clash with Indians near Fort Rupert, in which 15 Indians were killed and 5 wounded. Warren himself received a charge of buckshot, which laid him up for a time. But the reason why none of the crew of the Thornton were killed and the ship was not overrun by the First Nations was because they had repeating Martini rifles, which the First Nations people did not. And that outgunned the First Nations and ended up in pretty well a massacre. That was one of the last violent incidents between First Nations and traders going up and down the coast, the British Columbian coast. In 1871, after dropping Thomas Russell off, we saw the refit of the Thornton, the beginning of Russell and a partner starting to build up a fleet of vessels which were sealing as far afield as the Bering Sea. The Thornton itself was wrecked off Unalaska in about 1886 while sealing in that area. The sealing venture ended in 1891 in litigation and Warren's financial ruin. He was still active, however, in the 1890s and was shipping passengers and supplies to the Klondike goldfields. He retired in 1900 and died in 1917. Just one of the interesting characters that Thomas Russell interacted with during his employment with the coal company. A brief look at Russell's crew at the mine, which was motley to say the least. There were 3, this was the crew that went up on the Thornton with him. Lakin, Riley, and Beauchamp were obviously settlers. And there were 3 Chinamen, Ah Chi, Ah Hen, and Ah Loy. Of the 3 white men, Riley, an Irishman, was a particularly bad apple. He was convicted of whiskey selling. And as this article shows, he was charged by Sergeant Millen of the Victoria Police with supplying spirits to the Indians, was found guilty, and was remanded for 3 days for sentence. The article, somewhat amusingly, says, "It's a disgrace to see a healthy and strong man like Riley selling whiskey. He ought to be ashamed of himself and seek a more manly living. During the 3 days while Riley was awaiting sentence, Riley, who had already been contracted by the coal company, was basically saved from going to prison by the coal company, pleading that if Riley was escorted down to the Thornton, put on board, and shipped up to the Queen Charlotte's, could they please have him to work their coal mine instead of him sitting in jail in Victoria. And the Pemberton, who was the chief of police, agreed to that. So in Thomas Russell's diary, you can hear about Riley being escorted down by Sergeant McMillan to the ship at 4 o'clock in the morning. The trip up from Victoria was an eventful and interesting journey. And I'm going to point out a couple of things that happened en route, not all the interesting things that happened, but just a couple to give you a taste for what it was like to sail up to the Queen Charlotte's at that time, and also to see some of the natural wealth in terms of animal and fish life in the area before rampant colonial overharvesting. So we're starting at number 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, working our way up. Number 1, I named dislocation. They had just left Victoria and the wind died. On the night of the 22nd, Thomas Russell was awakened, well, maybe about 2 o'clock in the morning, by a bump and someone going up outside. He thought maybe to go and have a pee. When Russell himself got up to relieve himself at about 5 o'clock in the morning, he went up on deck and saw a man called Beauchamp, one of his employees, huddled sitting on one of the hatches, nursing his shoulder. And it turns out that Beauchamp's shoulder had been dislocated. He had bumped his shoulder, dislocated it while trying to get out of the cabin, and was in agony. Russell roused up the captain and Mr. Warren, and they spent about half an hour or so trying to get Beauchamp's shoulder back in, to no avail. And they were in a bit of a pickle. There was no wind. They couldn't go anywhere. They needed to get Beauchamp to a doctor, but it took 2 days before they were able to get into Nanaimo. They hadn't intended to go to Nanaimo, but they decided they had to. It took them 2 days to get there. And it wasn't until the morning of the 25th that Russell was able to bring Beauchamp to the doctor in Nanaimo. And the doctor snapped his arm back, his shoulder back into place. And the moment the joint went in, Beauchamp laughed the first time in 2 days. What a relief, no more agony. Natural abundance. Just after leaving Victoria Harbour, Russell comments on the number of whales that were sporting about. And while they were becalmed, lots of salmon were jumping about in dozens. Going further north, when they were abreast of Hornby Island, Thomas notes at 7 p.m. sighting the place on Hornby Island where Dawson has taken up his whaling quarters. Great volumes of smoke rising. I presume they're frying out the oil. And what Russell was referring to was, this is Hornby Island here. On the northeast shore of Hornby Island, there's a place which today is still called Whaling Station Bay. And it's a whaling station set up by a guy called Dawson with a whaling company to harvest whales and create, to render down the oil. And what Russell saw was the smoke from the rendering plant active in this, in the whaling station on Hornby Island. It's an interesting history, the whaling in the area here. It flared up briefly and died due to over-harvesting. Dawson, a guy called Dawson and his nephew, this guy, Alexander Dawson Donaldson, set up a company. They started off whaling in Saanich Inlet in 1866. They were also catching dogfish for oil. They fairly quickly fished this particular area out. They got bigger boats and started fishing for whales or hunting whales in the Salish Sea, Georgia Strait. But they decided they moved to new grounds, and they set up a second whaling station, moved their operations up to Cortes Island, up on the north end, where they were in 1869. But in 1870, their whaling station was looted and destroyed by the local First Nation, and they decided it was better to get out of there. And in the early first half of 1870, they moved their operations down to Hornby, and that's what Thomas Russell saw the Hornby operations in 1870 when he went up there in September. Troubled waters. To get up past Vancouver Island, the Thornton had to sail up through this very narrow body of water through here. And this narrow body of water, which is Discovery Passage and Johnson Strait, was well known as troubled water because changing of the tides, the very narrowness of this area caused immense tidal currents. And a small boat like a single-masted sloop such as the Thornton had to be very careful navigating this area. They had to wait until they had to get in here and wait for the tide to be favorable to be able to run through Seymour Narrows and Discovery Passage. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made it. Even at relatively high tide, there are still whirlpools. This is a whirlpool I discovered while traversing the Seymour Narrows in July of last year. And Russell notes that they entered Johnson Strait at 8 o'clock. The rapids were running very strong. One of the whirlpools caught the vessel, carried her around 3 times before spitting her out. So a bit of an interesting moment for them. They finally got through the Narrows, and then they put the Chinese to work, put them in a little boat and got them towing the Thornton up through the rest of this area here before they were able to put a sail on her and start sailing again. Right up at the northeast end of Vancouver Island, between Nigel and Hope Islands, the Thornton was here, and just before entering open ocean, they passed through Shadwell Passage. And in doing so, Thomas noted they were passing the wreck of the Swanee. He misnamed it, actually, it's Suwanee. With part of her hull and paddle boxes still remaining on a rock. They were sailing down through here, and they saw the remains of this ship here, which had been wrecked 2 years previously. The Suwanee was a US naval ship, and she had hit an uncharted rock on a falling tide, and as the tide fell, the back of the ship was broken and she was a total loss. All the crew were saved, and they managed to salvage most of the contents of the ship by bringing them to the nearby island. The whole escapade was reported in the Harper's Weekly with this rather beautiful image of the dying ship here on September the 26th, 1868. And there's quite an extensive newspaper article discussing how it happened and how they salvaged the material from the ship. But a salutary reminder to Thomas Russell as they were on their passage that you had to be very careful. It was easy to wreck a ship in this area. And that's a perfect segue to what happened next, which was they were nearly shipwrecked themselves in the vicinity of Dufferin Island on the 3rd of October, 1870. What happened was that the captain of the Thornton mistook an opening between the rocks as the opening to Millbank Sound, which we were going to, and it ended up being a dead end. And the weather was pretty rough. And Thomas writes, "I feel truly thankful for having been spared and protected through the perils of last night. The sea was running mountains high, and the breakers on every side of us. We tried to run out to sea again and shook the reefs out of the sails, but to no purpose. There we were driving about, not knowing, but we might be dashed on the rocks at any moment. In fact, I gave up all hope of her getting out of it, and about 1 o'clock took off my coat and boots to be prepared for her striking. Whilst I was below doing this, she nearly struck. It was a miracle she escaped. They were trying to put her round when she missed stays, and I heard the captain cry out, 'Wear her quick or she's gone!' But God be thanked we escaped. A little wind struck up and blew her off. So a narrow escape. If they hadn't escaped, we wouldn't have Russell's diaries to talk about today. On the 10th of October, they arrived at Skidegate Inlet at the mine. And Thomas found the company works in a poor state, and he came to question the integrity of those who had preceded him. Some of the coal had been transported on the tramway to the wharf, but it hadn't been properly sorted from slack, and that required time-consuming work to clean it, and also there was less coal to ship. And this cleaning was exacerbated by the fact that it was raining frequently while Thomas was there, and black coal and black slack were hard to tell apart, whereas they were easier to tell in the summer when the coal was black and the slack was dark gray. So he was left with a dirty job to do, which took quite a bit of time. He also found the tramway was poorly constructed, dangerous, and in need of partial rebuilding. The mining itself was problematic, and the workforce he had to work with was of doubtful quality. On top of that, the winter was extremely harsh, with copious rain and a lot of snow, which frequently covered the tramway and impeded work significantly. In other words, Thomas was walking into a pile of trouble, and that's reflected in his diary. The next 6 months proved extremely challenging. The struggle to put together a load of 600 tons of coal before a ship arrived to take it away fills much of the narrative of his diary. Beset by accidents, horrendous injuries, a thin and complex coal deposit, inclement weather, disgruntled employees, and a theft of key supplies, the ship arrived to take the coal away but had to be sent away with a short cargo. However, Thomas was glad to see it go, because the captain was such a scurrilous son of a gun, and he was doing all sorts of naughty things, which you'll have to read the diary to find out. But they were threatening the relationship that Thomas had with the Haida people, and he needed to get rid of this captain. On top of this, Thomas was missing his family, and he was still mourning his son. And at times, this wore him down to the point of despair. And this is illustrated by a brief passage in his diary, not the only one of a similar vein. This is a weary, dreary hole, no change, but one continual groove of coal and seawashes and coal, and a growling, grumbling, ill-tempered set of men to deal with. I very often dream of being out of it, and I sincerely wish I was. So Thomas, at times, was extremely low. He also had to put up with accidents. I mentioned horrendous accidents. This is a lead up to one of them, which you'll have to read about. After a lapse of 30 minutes, I began to fear that something had gone wrong, and had just started to go up when an Indian came galloping down on the horse and said that Lakin had got killed by falling from the car. I cannot describe my feelings at that moment. My heart seemed to stand still at such sad tidings, but I immediately ran back to the house, got some brandy, lint, and tincture of arnica. And I did this in hopes that, and you'll have to read the diary to hear the rest. A little bit about the Haida that Thomas encountered. When Thomas arrived in Skidegate Inlet in 1870, he came at the tail end of a time of significant and rapid change for the Haida population. Successive pandemics during the 1860s had inflicted a severe reduction in the native population. And this, coupled with a decline in fur trading activity, prompted consolidation and relocation of traditional villages on the west side of the islands to the Skidegate Inlet area. These three villages here, Chattel and Kaisun, were ancient traditional villages, and this one here, Squaitau, or Old Gold Harbor, arose during the time of the gold rush. The pandemics in the 1860s and the lack of fur trading, these villages had been ideally suited for fur traders to come in from the ocean to trade with. No fur traders coming in, a significant decrease in population. The people of these villages here decided to up stakes and move and create a new village called Haina, or New Gold Harbor, here in Skidegate Inlet, near to their relatives in Skidegate. Here. These two villages, Skidegate, well, three villages, Skidegate, Haina, and Kumshewa, feature fairly prominently in Russell's diaries. And it's because of the translocation of the Haida people from those western villages that Thomas possibly met with a larger number of chiefs than normally could have been expected. He also encountered a changing cultural landscape with holdowners from the fur trading era. The chiefs were called captains, that was a holdover, and they were given various names from the fur trading era. But also they were facing pressures from whiskey bootlegging by unscrupulous ship owners and traders. And the Haida were also very quick to travel down by canoe down to Victoria and see what they could get and raid on the way down and on the way back. Of Thomas's interactions with the Haida, some were good, some were bad, some were funny, and some were sad. Thomas himself was a creature of his time, and he harbored general prejudices of the day against the native population. It is evident he had significant experience interacting with First Nations peoples in and around Victoria before going up to the Queen Charlotte's. That being said, despite his innate settler prejudices, his impressions of the Haida he met were largely influenced by the individual's personality. He was critical of those he perceived as dishonest, but respectful of those he felt he could trust. Not only was he dependent on the Haida for part of his workforce, but at times for his very survival. And we'll talk about his 2 canoe trips that he made, and his interactions in the Haida during those were remarkable for their hospitality and kindness. The presence of a Haida camp next to the mine buildings was both a help and a hindrance. They provided a workforce, but also led to considerable loss of vital supplies for mining activities. How did he communicate with the Haida? This little excerpt explains it. Had a visit from Captains Skidegate and Scotch Guy this evening. I get along very well with Skidegate as he speaks Chinook pretty fluently, but good-natured little Scotch Guy talks away for an hour, and I'm just as wise as when he began. He jumbles up Haida, Chinook, and English in such a way that I often wonder if he knows himself what he's talking about. Thomas was fluent in Chinook jargon, and Chinook jargon was a lingua franca or trading language used up and down the British Columbia coast. And today there are certain words which still survive from Chinook jargon in British Columbian colloquial English. You saw the word seawash when Thomas was so melancholy. That's a Chinook jargon for First Nations men. Seawash. His diary is peppered with Chinook jargon words, and there's a dictionary in the background information to help translate what Thomas was talking about. Tyee is a word that you're probably familiar with, and that means a leader in Chinook jargon. We're fortunate in that we have photographs of some of the buildings in the First Nations villages that Thomas visited that he would have seen. And these photographs were taken not while Thomas was there, but pretty soon after he left. This one is from the village of Haina, and it's the chief's house in Haina. That's an abandoned village now. It was the one, New Gold Harbor, that was set up when the western villages moved over into the Skidegate Inlet area. This particular man here is identified as Chief or Captain Gold. Whether it's the same Captain Gold as Thomas met with or a successor, I don't know. but Thomas would have seen this particular building when he visited Haina. Skidegate Village, Thomas was there relatively frequently. This is photographed just 7 years after Thomas left the Queen Charlotte's. It was photographed by George Mercer Dawson of the Geological Survey of Canada in 1878. Look at those totem poles. Thomas refers to the totem poles as sticks, and also note the canoes here. So this is a scene that Thomas would have seen when he visiting the Indian village in Skidegate. Not only did Thomas have to put up with troubles at the mine, but also the ship that was supposed to come and relieve them was late by over a month. And that caused them to run out of food. And this, of course, caused a lot of grumbling against the men, the gradual loss of coffee and tea and sugar and flour. And in the end, Thomas was forced to go on 2 canoe trips to go to nearby, or well, as close as possible, Hudson Bay depots to try and see if he could rustle up some victuals. One of the trips was to a village called Kamshewa, and the other was an epic journey up the east coast of Graham Island to the Hudson's Bay Company depot at what is known as Old Masset. And he did so with Indian paddlers in dugout canoe. These are the canoe journeys. This is 20 kilometers here. So the first journey he made was out to Kamshewa down here. Kamshewa is an Indian village, which had beside it a Hudson Bay depot run by a man called McKay, who was a Hudson Bay employee. They paddled around there, went to there, and unfortunately, the guy didn't have any victuals to spare. So they had to paddle all the way back to the mine. And then they decided, well, we got to go up to Masset, now called Old Masset, to a Hudson Bay depot there to try and get victuals. And he did an epic canoe journey up through here, some 200 kilometers up to Old Masset, to the Hudson Bay depot there, where they were well met by the gentlemen, the Hudson Bay Company gentlemen, who gave them some victuals they could bring back. And they were also very warmly received by the local Haida chief. Interestingly, I told you there were 4 notebooks. The last notebook was written in pencil, and it's the notebook that Thomas brought on his canoe trip up to Masset. He wrote it in pencil because he was traveling and he was out in the elements, and you couldn't write with pen and ink. So he wrote, this is written en route. And just a little excerpt here shows how much they were exposed to the elements. Last night was a fearful night. The wind roared as though it would bring the trees and mountains over us, and the rain pounded down in torrents. I've never witnessed such a night. And there they were out sleeping under the canoe, hidden behind logs on the shoreline, trying to shelter from this storm on the way. And that, frankly, these canoe trips are amazing, and to read about them in the diary is somewhat incredible. This is the village at Kamshewa that Thomas would have seen when he went down there to visit the McKay's Hudson Bay Company depot there. This was photographed by Dawson in 1878, 7 years after Thomas was there. And this is the village of, was called Masset, now called Old Masset, where Thomas was in April of 1871, again photographed by Dawson in 1878. And this particular house here, we know Thomas stayed in this house on night of April the 22nd, 1871. And this is a slightly later photograph taken by another photographer, Dossiter, in 1881, of the house that Thomas stayed in while he was visiting Masset to try and get grub for his crew back at Skidegate Inlet. Finally, on the 8th of May, the Hudson Bay Company steamer Otter arrived, having battled headwinds and taking 8 hours to get to Skidegate from Fort Simpson. And they were welcomed at 8 o'clock in the evening on May the 7th by the miners at Skidegate Inlet. The next day, this article is written by a reporter who went on the ship to write about the travels of this Hudson Bay Company ship, the Otter, up and down the British Columbia coast. They say they saw McKay's schooner alert in the bay. McKay was the guy who owned or ran the Hudson Bay Depot at Kamshewa. And the following morning, on the 8th of May, they commenced loading coal from the mine on board the steamer. They took on board 50 tons of very fine quality coal. And at 6 p.m. on the same day, with Mr. Russell and 7 men, left for Victoria. So Thomas Russell was on his way home, finally, after a harrowing experience in the Queen Charlottes. When he got home, he discovered that the company was in liquidation. And that, I think, explains why the ship coming to relieve them was late, because there was significant disarray in the company. And maybe they forgot about the guys in the Queen Charlottes waiting to be picked up. However, Thomas dodged another bullet when he got down there. The company, as I said, was in liquidation. There was a Supreme Court action going on. But thanks to a Supreme Court action on the 26th of June, it's noted here, Mr. Johnson made application that the wages of Mr. Russell, the foreman, engaged at the Queen Charlotte coal mine since commencement of the winding up of the company, be paid out of the first funds coming into the hands of the liquidators. If that hadn't happened, Thomas may never have been paid for his months up in the Queen Charlottes. The same order was made for Lakin, who was one of the key workmen that worked with Russell at the mine. I don't know what happened to the others, whether they got paid or not. Aftermath. I don't know what Thomas did between his return to Victoria in 1871 and 1873, but from 1873 to 1902, he worked as assessor and tax collector for the city of Victoria. His bad luck persisted. In 1880. His second child, daughter Catherine, passed away at the age of 18, a very sad occurrence. And there's some very poignant newspaper articles about the return of her body with flags flying at half-mast from New Westminster for burial to Victoria. In 1902 to 1912, Thomas worked as bookkeeper for Thorpe and Company, which was a soda water and soft drink manufacturer in Victoria. He passed away on the 14th of August, 1912, having been predeceased by his wife, Sarah, who died in 1905. Thomas Russell actually died at the house of his daughter, Mrs. Michael. She had married, his eldest child had married a farmer, Michael family, up in the Cedar District. And Thomas was there when he passed away. His body was taken back down to Victoria for interment. So where does he lie? His body lies in Ross Bay Cemetery, and there's something rather sad about it, that neither Thomas or his wife Sarah are recorded with a headstone. Sarah Russell occupies a plot on her own. The plot beside it contains the remains of Thomas Russell and also the remains of his 4-year-old son and 18-year-old daughter. There is a headstone for that plot. How do I know where they lay? Well, I talked to the Ross Bay Cemetery staff, and they were good enough to open their massive safe, huge cast iron safe containing the ledgers for the Ross Bay Cemetery. And here we are identifying that Road 18 West, plot 73, contains the body of Sarah Russell. Initially, he thought it was Catherine, but no, it wasn't. It was Sarah, the wife. And plot 74 contains the remains of Thomas Russell, his daughter Catherine, and his son Robert Henry. The headstone that is present on the grave that contains the three of them is a Lamb of God headstone, which is a classic Victoria headstone for a child, Robert Henry, who died at age 4. It also records the daughter Catherine, who died in 1880. There's no mention of Thomas, but this headstone was moved, and originally it was located in the Pioneer Cemetery in Victoria and was moved down to Ross Bay. And actually in Ross Bay, it was moved at least once, ending up at this location, because both the boy and his sister, Catherine, were interred. The boy was removed from Ross Bay Cemetery, from the Pioneer Cemetery to Ross Bay, interred in a plot. Catherine was interred in another plot. They were subsequently exhumed and interred along with their father in this location. Thomas's presence is not noted by a headstone, and neither is that of his wife. So it's a bit sad. Where is the diary now? This is Michael Gould, the great-great-grandson of Thomas Russell. This is his cousin, Kerry Parker. And I was present with them when they donated the diary to the Saanich Archives for incorporation into the significant Russell family funds that are already present in the Saanich Archives. The Saanich Archives is only a stone's throw away from the Craigflower School and the Craigflower Manor location of the Craigflower Farm, where Thomas Russell started his career in the New World. So his diary rests pretty close to where he started his life in the New World. Just as a final note here, this isn't the first time, my website is not the first time that Thomas's Russell, or a portion of Thomas's Russell, was published. A précis was published as a substantial article in the Victoria Daily Times in 1914 under the heading "Mining Coal in the Queen Charlotte's 40 Years Ago, an unusual record, interesting reminiscences gleaned from the diaries of the late Thomas Russell, former City Assessor Victoria." So Thomas Russell's relatives must have lent his diary 2 years after his death to a reporter who wrote up a substantial article for the Victoria Daily Times. The article was also picked up by a newspaper called the Queen Charlotte Islander the same year, which published it as a 3-part series in August 8th, 15th, and 22nd. The Queen Charlotte Islander was a local newspaper in the Queen Charlottes, and its mandate was to promote settlement of the Queen Charlotte Islands. So even in 1914, they recognized that there was something special about Thomas Russell's diaries. So I hope I've piqued your interest to read the diaries. Go to the website, just Google Ladysmith Historical Society Thomas Russell Diary, and it'll get you there. Finally, I have to mention help from people. I've got to thank Michael Gould for bringing the diary to the attention of the Ladysmith Archives. Both he and his cousin, Kerry Parker, were unwaveringly generous with their time and knowledge of family history. I want to shout out for Kimberly Head and Caitlin Bursey of the Saanich Archives for accepting the diary into the Russell family funds. Joanne Valpy, who gave an informative tour of the National Historic Site at Craigflower Manor and discussing Russell and Mackenzie family histories related to the site. The City of Victoria staff at the Ross Bay Cemetery were very gracious, took time to show me the location of the Russell family graves, and also gave access to the ledgers within those huge safes in their building on site. Dr. Jan Boxall explained all the medicines that were employed by Thomas Russell. I haven't spent any time here explaining them, but it's fascinating what Thomas Russell used to try and combat some of the ailments that he encountered during his stay in the Queen Charlotte's. Some pretty horrendous medications which wouldn't pass muster today. And finally, I want to thank my son, Tristan, who gave me a lot of help for incorporating the diary and the associated background research into a website and for assisting with this. And I want to thank you for listening. It's been a long haul. I hope I didn't put you all to sleep. Thank you.